Assumption number 2, peaceful social being is preferable to isolation and to war. In consequence, it justly and rightly demands some sacrifice of individual impulse and idiosyncrasy. Okay, so you want to live alone in the bush? You're going to starve to death and be eaten by black flies. It's not a good solution. Okay, so you have to cooperate with other people, and that means you can't get to be your whimsical self 100% of the time. It means that most of you has to be sacrificed so that you can be approximately like everyone else. Now that's a real sacrifice, right? It's a sacrifice of it might even be a sacrifice of some of the unique qualities that everyone needs from you. Socialization costs, but the advantage of it is, well, we get to exist. Look, we can all sit together in this hall and no one has their hands around each other's throats. And we're talking about serious things. Okay, man, that's worth something. And what it's worth in part is you don't get to be whatever spectacularly colored creature you want to be all the time. You have to do what you can to be normal and predictable. And it's not like normal and predictable is the highest virtue, because it's not. And being more than normal and being unique and creative and contributing in that way is extraordinarily important. But the fundamental point is that social being requires the sacrifice of a certain amount of individual idiosyncrasy. And that's a fundamentally conservative claim. It's like you should do what everyone else does unless you have a really good reason to vary. It's a good rule. It's like you do what people have done throughout time. You grow up, you find a partner, you establish a stable relationship, you get a job, you make yourself useful, you have some children, you do something productive and interesting with your spare time, and you try to act like a respectable human being. That's what you do. That's a conservative ethos. And if you have something spectacular about you that needs to be revealed to the world, then break some rules, man. Go right ahead. I'm dead serious about that. But most of the time you don't. And even if you happen to be a special person, and you might be, 90% of you still isn't special. So most of the time you're still going to be following the rules. And the rules aren't there to oppress. They're there to keep us away from each other's throats. Because human beings are very warlike, and we're very competitive, and we're very aggressive. And if we are fortunate enough to have woven together a social fabric that basically renders us peaceful and cooperative, we should try disrupting that at our great peril. Because the general rule for human existence throughout the centuries has been turmoil and war. And we don't have that here. And so thank God for that. And it's worth a bit of a sacrifice.
Someone else's rights are my responsibility and vice versa. That almost defines the relationship between rights between people. And liberty is not the allowance to engage in every short-term hedonistic whim impulse. That's chaos. That's not liberty. Liberty is more like what occurs when you have skillful players who are all playing the same game. And game is a good model, right? Because the people who are playing a game, well, they want to play the game. So you're in a free association if you're playing a game. If you're compelled to play, it's not a game. So you have to do it freely. You have to do it voluntarily. You have to abide by a set of governing principles that lay out the domain for peaceful cooperation and competition within the game. Imagine a game of opposing teams, let's say. And so the rules underneath are the preconditions for the freedom of the game. And so liberty, if liberty is the playing of a game, which I think is an optimized description of liberty, then it has to take place within a set of agreed upon rules that set the playing field for the game. And there aren't an unlimited number of playable games. We know this not least because of attempts to produce multiplayer worlds online. Some multiplayer worlds degenerate into chaos and catastrophe because they turn out not to be iterable playable games. And so the universe of playable games is actually structured in some way that we don't fully explicitly understand, but it does abide by certain principles. Like, well, for it to be a game, it has to be a game played by people who are voluntarily associating. And then there has to be a minimum number of principles that everyone understands. And there has to be some structure of hierarchical punishment and threat and reward. And you have to be a good loser, and you have to be a good winner, and you have to want to play the game again. And you have to facilitate the development of your teammates, all of that. And so liberty has to be construed not so much as the absence of super-ego-like rules that are doing nothing but imposing upon your hedonic, narcissistic, biological whims, as more like the integral balancing of all your motivations and emotions within an iterable structure. That's liberty. It's like a game. When God tells Moses to tell the Pharaoh to let the people go, that is not what he says. He does not say, tell Pharaoh to let my people go. He tells Pharaoh, let my people go so they may serve me in the wilderness. And that's repeated 10 times, which means that God means it, by the way, because that's why he says it 10 times. And it means something like, when you move from freedom and you move into chaos, all you've done is move from tyranny into the desert. And the desert's no better than the tyranny. That's why the Israelites get all fractious in the desert. That's why they wander around blindly for 40 years. It's like out of the tyranny where everything was ordered into the desert where nothing is ordered. It's like that's not an improvement. And whatever the promised land is, it's not the mere domain of narcissistic 2-year-old impulsive whims and freedoms. In that sense, I can do anything. It's like, well, no, you can't. No, you can't. And you don't even want to.
Let's say you're miserable and unhappy. Okay, here's a cure. Find what's valuable and let it go. So we could say, well, maybe it's a relationship that you have. Maybe it's a relationship with your parents, right? And the relationship is pathological, but you're locked into it. You value it. And no wonder, because it's a relationship with your parents. And you're suffering terribly because of it. Well, what do? Maybe you let it go. It's a sacrifice. And the idea is that, well, that'll clear the future for you. Well, very frequently when people are suffering terribly, not always, because sometimes you just suffer stupidly, blindly, and without recourse, you know. You get cancer and then you die. So we have no idea how to deal with that. But sometimes the reason that you're suffering is because you just won't let go of the thing that's biting you. And you think, well, I can't let go of, and I've had clients like this. I can't stop communicating with my mother who phones me 3 times a day, every day of my life, and never says anything that isn't unbelievably critical and demeaning. I can't let that go. It's like, well, that's not such a good idea. The funny thing too, often when people let something like that go, it goes away, sorts itself out, and then comes back. So they don't even end up losing it. But unless they're willing to let it go, to sacrifice it, they make no headway whatsoever. And so one of the rules is, if people are impeding your development, you sacrifice your relationship with them, right? It's a very, very rough rule.
One of the things that my family has learned, because we've been the targets of many serpentine attacks, is that we could turn an attack into an opportunity if we were careful, if we looked for the opportunity, if we could see the adversarial force even as, it's very stretching things to say this, but as something to be grateful for. It is definitely the case that the journalists who've attacked me the most viciously have been the most profound contributors to my success. Well, isn't that strange though, right? Because that isn't what you'd think. And so what we learned was that when we were attacked, if we could hold our ground and try to, I don't mean seek naively for the silver lining in the sort of sense that this is the best of all possible worlds in that Panglossian sense, but to turn even adversarial challenge into a field of opportunity, that's a practice, right? It's something you can get better and better at. And in any situation, no matter how difficult, perhaps it's your ability to seek out what you could be humbly grateful for that will guide you through it. So imagine, I've seen this when people were encountering death. So when my wife's mother died, she died of a terrible degenerative neurological condition akin to Alzheimer's. And it was pretty damn brutal because neurological diseases are pretty brutal. And so we just lost pieces of her, you know, day by day for 15 years. And it was quite the catastrophe for the family, but it was something to watch too, because her husband, Del Roberts, my father-in-law, who was quite the man about town in our little town. He was like the most extroverted person in the whole town, and he is quite the party animal, and a great guy, great sense of humor. He cared for his wife so diligently that it was really a miracle to watch. And his children were grateful to him for that, and it increased their love for him. And as she died, and then when she died, the family looked at each other and realized what they had in each other, and they pulled together in quite a remarkable way, dispensing with many of the unpleasant and unnecessary fractious disagreements that had destroyed their unity or had impaired their unity. They had a pretty good family, but no family is perfect. They came together in this time of death, and it was partly because they looked around to see what they had that they could be grateful for. And what was so interesting about that was that it was a balm, B-A-L-M, for the death itself. It isn't like my mother-in-law's death was nothing. It wasn't like that didn't tear a hole in the fabric of the family's being, but because they were able to orient themselves to what was good that they had with themselves, which in some sense was an infinite resource that they could draw on, as of yet unrevealed possibilities of love to provide them with succor through their grief. And then that became permanent. And so you just don't know, you know, how skillful could you get if one of the things you practiced was gratitude? And then you can also think of it not as a form of naivety, because naive people can be grateful because they don't know better, but as a form of courage, right? Because the world is a terrible and formidable place, and you have real adversaries, and sometimes deadly adversaries in nature and in culture. And if you can cultivate that sense of rigorous gratitude, then God only knows what you could extract even from the worst of situations. And don't you need to know how you could best extract what was best from the worst of situations? And gratitude is one of the virtues that allows you to do exactly that. And so it's worth practicing, right? It's a practice. It's a courageous practice. It's not just something you should do, right? It's something that illuminates everything, to see the mystery and beauty in things, even in moments of tragedy. That's a real art, you know. It's the art of great artists to do that. In the Brothers Karamazov, for example, it's pretty obvious that Ivan, who is the atheistic and charismatic brother, Karamazov, is the intellectual superior to Alyosha, and also he's superior rhetorically. He makes one of the best cases for atheism on moral grounds that has ever been made in literature. But Alyosha is by far the more morally superior character. And you experience that moral superiority implicitly by watching how he manifests himself in the book. It's not an intellectual argument, it's an argument of narrative. And so Dostoevsky can show how the properly oriented soul can defeat even the sharpest rational intellect. And Dostoevsky explores that again in The Idiot, because Mishkin is a savior figure. And although in some sense you might say he loses all the battles, he wins the war. And that's a useful thing to know about your life, is that, but this is, for example, I think why it requires faith to tell the truth. And why faith is a necessity. Faith is a necessity because you don't know what you're doing. And you can't in any final sense, so you have to always leap into the darkness. You have no choice. Well, you do. You can not leap into the darkness, but then the darkness just engulfs you. So that's a choice, but it's not a good one. Because you're ignorant in some fundamental sense, and because the future differs from the past, you have to leap into the unknown with principle. And one principle can be that the truth will set you free. And then the question is, well, how is that manifest? You say, well, I get in trouble when I tell the truth. It's like, yeah, fair enough. You also get in trouble when you don't tell the truth. You get to choose between the kinds of trouble, but you don't get to dispense with trouble itself. And the thing, what you have to decide this, is that if you build a world based on truth around you, is that the best of all possible worlds? And you can't use any given outcome to inform that, because many times when you say what you have to say, the first response is going to be trouble. And you'll think, well, I should have just lied. And why do you lie? Well, you lie so you don't get in trouble, obviously. Or you lie because you want to gain something that's not yours by right. And so you take this short-term approach to extracting order from chaos, and you think that's a victory, but it's not. It's a loss. But the loss is in some sense only demonstrable by faith, right? Is the world that you extract using truth the best possible world? You have to stake your life on that to find out. There's no other way of finding out. So, and that's what Mishkin does in The Idiot. And so everyone thinks he's an idiot, but what did Carl Jung say? The fool is the precursor to the savior. And that's true in many, many ways. It's many, many ways. And so, you know, naive people blurt out the truth because they don't know any better, but wise people tell the truth because they know it's the best way forward. And both of them might look like fools, but that doesn't mean that they are. So
faith is a presupposition for living in the truth. And then you might ask yourself another question, which is, well, why bother living in the truth? Well, one answer would be so that reality doesn't rise up and smite you repeatedly, which it will if you're deceptive. So that's one answer, but here's another answer, and this is a better answer. People ask themselves all the time, what's the purpose of life? And there's a variety of answers to that. There's no purpose. We're just atoms on a dust mote at the edge of a rather reprehensible corner of the cosmos, and we exist for a moment and we're out, and that's that. Or we're so lost in a plethora of subordinate meanings that we're confused and aimless. Or we want to be hedonistically happy, and I would say that's really the offer that's on the table in our culture most of the time. It's like, well, I just want to be happy. And people will say that to you. It's a slogan. It's the most common slogan of our time, I would say, and it's such a preposterous slogan. It's like, what do you mean just? You just want to be happy. That's all. That's all you want. That absolute impossibility. You want bliss unending no matter what you do, and that's all you want. It's not exactly a small ask, let's say, because it's the same thing as asking to dwell permanently in paradise. It's something like that. So it's not that likely. And then it also isn't true. That isn't what you want. If you do careful analysis of what people mean when they say they just want to be happy, what they mean is they don't want to suffer stupidly. They're much more concerned, we're much more concerned with not experiencing an excess of negative emotion than we are with experiencing a surfeit of positive pleasure. So first of all, we don't mean we just want to be happy. We mean, please don't make us too miserable. And fair enough, that's reasonable. But then even on the happiness front, even on the absence of misery front, that's not true. One of the things Dostoevsky pointed out in Notes from Underground, which is so bloody brilliant, he was criticizing the idea of materialist utopia. He said something like, well, imagine we made our materialist utopian dreams come true, and everybody had enough to eat all the cakes they wanted and enough to drink and nothing to do, he said, but busy themselves with the continuation of the species. And we were so pleased that we emitted nothing but bubbles of bliss. He said, human beings were so damn ungrateful that the first thing we do is take a stick and smash up all that comfortable prosperity just so that something unexpected and provocative could happen. And that's very smart, you know, that's hearkening in some sense back to the story of the Garden of Eden and the proclivity of human beings to eat the forbidden fruit. It's like it isn't obvious at all that we want happiness.
It isn't even obvious that we want absence of misery. What's really obvious is that we want an adventure. We want an adventure that's so compelling that it makes the misery of life not just justifiable, but worthwhile. You want to look back on your life, you know. You want to look back on your life, and you know this to be true. You want to be able to say to yourself, even considering a month or a week or a series of days, you want to be able to say, that was really difficult, but you know what? It was worth it. And I think that's what you want from your life. It's something like, you know what? That was difficult, but it was worth it. And that meant that the adventure was so great that it justified the difficulties. And so then the question is, and here's the question, where do you find the great adventure of your life? Well, how about in truth? Well, why? Because you don't know what's going to happen if you tell the truth. It's a mystery. It's going to lay itself out for you. And so that's an adventure, because you literally do not know what's going to happen. You have to let go of knowing what's going to happen. And so then you have that adventure, and then what is also the case is that it's you that's having the adventure. Right? Because if what you're doing is living in truth, that's you. That truth is you. And so that means that whatever happens when you tell the truth is your adventure. And then you think, well, I'm using deception. It's like, well, maybe you are, but maybe deception is using you. And then maybe it's the spirit of deception that's having the adventure of your life. And then you might ask yourself, well, why are you so miserable and unhappy? And the answer would be, well, the spirit of deception is having the adventure of your life. You're not even there. Because if you're not living in truth, you're not there. Obviously, what's there is the spirit of deception. And you might think that's your deception, but I would be very careful about thinking that, because there have been centuries of meditation on the nature of the spirit of deception. And the answer isn't that the spirit of deception is you. The answer is that the spirit of deception is something that possesses you and convinces you that it's you. And that's not something you want to fall into the clutches of. So now you have to tell me the question again.
I'm certain you answered it. This was about teenagers.
Oh, yes, yes. Well, back to the teenagers. Do you not want to go to college, or are you just lying about being lazy? So that's a question, and we can ask ourselves that question. And as I said, on the teenage front, craft a vision, you know, craft a compelling vision. That's really what we are as human beings, is we're visionaries. That's how we confront the horizon of the future. We meet the horizon of the future by crafting a compelling vision. And your vision might not involve a college education, but it should be a vision that makes you think, if I could make that come true, it would justify the trouble that it would take to manage it. And I think that's the right attitude to take towards your life. And you know, we're all going to have our crosses to bear in the most fundamental manner. We all have to deal with the catastrophe of mortality. And I think we all have to deal with the reality of hell. And you can think about that religiously or not. Political hell will do for hell as far as I'm concerned. We certainly saw no shortage of evidence for that in the 20th century. And we all have to contend with that, right? The reality of mortality and the reality of hell. And then we all have to contend with the fact that we have to develop a vision for our life that is so compelling that it justifies those bitter realities. You know, God calls people to the adventure of their lives. And so you could say in part, God is that force within you which calls you to the adventure of your life. And it says, get away from your family, get away from your blind and unconscious comfort, and get the hell out there in the world. Well, God calls Abraham out from his fathers where he stayed far too long, and from his kin where it's secure. And like the first thing he encounters is a famine, and then he encounters a tyranny inhabited by people who want to steal his wife. It's like you think, well, Abraham should have just stayed in bed and ignored God, obviously. Well, that isn't how it is. It's like we're built for struggle, us human beings. You're not after the bubbles of bliss that Dostoevsky described in Notes from Underground. We're built to contend with the world. We're built to contend with reality. You want a challenge, and the best way that you can take on a challenge, because a challenge fortifies you. So you don't want to be secure, you want to be strong. And you get strong by taking on optimal challenges. And so you lay out your destiny in the world, and you take the slings and arrows of fate, and you make yourself stronger while you're doing so. And you might fail, and fortune might do you in, but it's your best bet.
There's more to us than there is to the horror. As nature is, bent on our destruction. Bad as culture is, tyrannical and bloody, back as far as you can look. As malevolent as you are in the darkest part of your heart. And that's plenty malevolent. The possibility that's within you that can well up, the courage and the truth and the ability and the skill and the willingness to set things right, if you are willing to set them right, is more powerful than all of that. And so it's so interesting. It was proof for me of an old saying I read from Carl Jung. It's an alchemical motif, in sterquilinus inventur, which is what you most want to be found will be found where you least want to look, essentially. And it's so interesting because it means that if you're willing to turn around and to stand up, say, and stand up straight and face the darkness like fully, what you discover at the darkest part is the brightest light. And that's something that's so much worth discovering, because there's going to be terrible darkness in your life. And it's going to make you cynical and bitter. And it could easily be that you're just not looking at it enough. Because if you looked at it enough and you didn't shy away and you brought everything you had to bear on it, you'd find that there was more to you than there was to the horror. You know, I watched my father-in-law. I'll end with this. And you know, you don't know, because you're not bringing your A game to the table with all that cynicism and bitterness and resentment and willful blindness and avoidance. Maybe you're playing at 60%. It's not good enough because there's too much of what's bad for 60% to be good enough. It's like you need 90% or 95% or 100%. When about 15, 20 years ago, my mother-in-law developed frontal temporal dementia, which I wouldn't recommend. You know, it's one of those degenerative neurological diseases like Alzheimer's, and those bloody things are like they're in the top echelon of awful. You know, you watch a person deteriorate before your eyes. It's a lengthy, lengthy death. And it was slow. And her husband, he lived in this little town that I grew up in, about 3,000 people. And he was quite a character, man. Everybody knew him. I bought him a Foghorn Leghorn t-shirt once, because that's kind of what he was like. He was loud and sort of bombastic, but he stood up straight, I can tell you. And he played the fool a little bit, mostly for the amusement of people, but he was no damn fool. And I always admired him and liked him. And the feeling was mutual, thank God, since I married his daughter. And, you know, he drank a lot with his crazy friends up in northern Alberta, and he wasn't at home a lot because he was working a lot. And you know, he was kind of a party animal about town, but a good businessman and a good man. And then his wife got sick, and they moved to another town. And, you know, he took care of her for like 15 years. It was unbelievable as she deteriorated, you know, and she got more desperate to have him around, and her love for him never went away. Even as she lost herself almost completely, she would always light up when he came into the room, you know, and he took care of her right till within weeks of her death. He had to finally put her in an old folks' home because he was no longer strong enough to lift her up from the chair. And we interacted with him a lot, you know, because we were trying to help him figure out how to cope. And we had signs put up in the house, electronic signs that would tell her when he was leaving so that she would know where he went. And we had recordings in the bathroom so that she knew what to do when she went into the bathroom. And we tried to do everything we could to not make this absolutely bloody, atrocious experience complete hell. And he participated the whole way, you know, and it was really something to see. It was really it left me with a tremendous sense of admiration for him, but not just for him, but for people who can do that, you know. And if there was a new decline, he took it on, and he didn't complain about it. And he tried to do what he could, you know, and like, it was no picnic, don't get me wrong, but it wasn't hell. And then we were all gathered around the deathbed, her mother's, my wife's mother's deathbed, and the family was there, and they got along pretty well, you know. Her sister's a palliative care nurse, and the other one's a pharmacist, and none of them are particularly afraid of illness and death. You know, they're a pretty tough group. And so, you know, they made sure their mother's lips were wet while she was no longer eating or drinking, and tried to make her comfortable. And they're around the deathbed, and they were kind of getting along, you know. It wasn't family feud at mother's death time, and that was kind of nice. And she died, and that was that. But it wasn't just that, because the fact that the family had coped with it well and nobly and honorably, I would say, brought them together. They were closer afterwards than they were before. And they all had more respect for their father. And then in the old folks' home, he met another woman who had a husband there who had Alzheimer's. And they got to know each other, you know. And he died after a while, and she died after a while. And then a few months later, they started going out. And then eventually they had a relationship, and now they live together. And so he gained something. Like, it wasn't that he replaced what he lost, you know what I mean? Because he still has pictures of his wife up in his house, and she was the love of his life, and that's not going away. But, you know, his family respected him more, and everybody pulled together more, and it wasn't hell at the deathbed, it was just tragedy, and the family pulled together more. And that was a good example of how you can extract at least a certain amount of light out of what's dark, even at a personal level. And it's worth asking yourself. It's like, drop what you're doing that's foolish, that you know is foolish, and pick an aim that's worthwhile, you know, to make things better for yourself, like you're worth taking care of, like you're worth something, you know, and to surround yourself with people who believe the same, and who are rejoicing in your accomplishments and unhappy when you fail, right? And you're comparing yourself to your accomplishments of yesterday and not to someone else's today, so that you're not jealous and bitter. And you put your own house in order so that you're not cursing the world when some of its disarray might be your fault. And you're trying to pursue something meaningful, and you're doing your best to tell the truth, and all of that. And then you see what happens. Who the hell are you? You know, you think you're a miracle of some bloody bizarre sort. We've been around for 3.5 billion years. You know, every single one of your relatives propagated successfully. And here you are, against all possible odds, in this world of hell in some sense, and bitterness and tyranny and malevolence. And yet, God only knows what's inside you, this capacity for consciousness, the capacity to confront potential and to turn it into something good. That's us, man. That's the Western story. That's the individual as the cornerstone of the state. That's our responsibility, and it really is who we are. And so we need to know that, and we need to remember it, and we need to act it out. And then maybe we can see what we can do about it, you know, and see how good we could make things. And maybe that would be the purpose of your damn life, right? Not to be happy. It's like, there's problems to be solved. Be happy after you solve the goddamn things, right? So I learned, because I looked at dark things, that I learned that the light was more powerful than the darkness as far as that I was concerned, and that people were capable, each of us, of remarkable things, and that we need to know that that's what we are. We're this consciousness that confronts potential with all its catastrophe. That's what we are. That's what makes us in the image of God. That's what gives us our intrinsic value. And that idea that we have intrinsic value, that's the bedrock presupposition of our state. We're going to question that, or we're going to live it out. Better to live it out. Find out who you are. Thank you very much.